Please welcome Nayeli Jimenez.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. This is my first Creative Mornings. I'm a creative in Vancouver, but I'm definitely not a morning person, so bear with me. But I'm very honored to have been invited here today. I would also like to acknowledge that today we stand in the unceded ancestral traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I think it's particularly important that we acknowledge that when our theme this week is justice. Indigenous communities have been giving us some of the most amazing leadership in the climate justice movement, and they're the ones who drive the most meaningful action. And I think we all have a huge responsibility to learn from them and stand beside them. So my name is Nayeli Jimenez, as Christine introduced me. I'm a communication designer and currently working as the art director at Greystone Books, but I'm also a climate justice organizer. And I wanted to start by stating what I do and acknowledging those two hats, one in design and one in climate justice, because sometimes people react surprised or confused, even impressed, but to be honest, mostly just curious to see where the overlap is between designing books for a living and organizing for climate justice. And most people often just ask me, how do you have time to do both? And I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, I look like a 28-year-old, but I'm really a 75-year-old inside. But one of my most recent conversations with a surprised human was just a couple of months ago when I was asked to speak at the Vancouver launch of the Pact for a Green New Deal. This was a press conference where I was beside Dr. David Suzuki, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, City Council Christine Boyle, and Dan Mangan. And we'll get more into what the Green New Deal is later on when I talk about what I'm doing now. But basically, I was asked to be there representing the voices of young people that are fighting for their futures. So I was asked to sit down right next to David Suzuki. And for context, at Greystone, we publish all of David's books, and we also publish a lot of books in partnership with the David Suzuki Foundation. So he politely said hello and asked me who I was. And I was like, hi, I'm Nayeli. We've actually met before. I'm the art director at Greystone. And he finally looked up at me, surprised, and said, what the hell are you doing here? Which is so honest and direct in classic David Suzuki fashion, which I've always admired so much in him. But it's a legitimate question, and he seemed genuinely curious to know how I had gotten a seat at that table. And here I am giving him the side eye later on. I mean, no hard feelings. But the question is legitimate. How indeed? Wow, that's upside down. That's Mexico upside down. I'm not sure why. And we'll see. Oh, no, that's okay, cool. So that's Mexico upside down, my country. Which I guess explains a lot of our current situation. So I was born and raised in Mexico in a middle-class family with the two most hardworking parents in a very loud and crazy but really close extended family. And it was thanks to them and their hard work that prioritized my education since I was born. And that's how I was able to immigrate to Canada in 2008 to study communication design at Emily Carr University. Already back then, even though I was officially embracing my creativity by choosing design over engineering as a career, I was just starting to learn about the world and what we called sustainability. For those of us who grew up in the 90s, and probably earlier as well, the concept of environmentalism was always narrowed down to things like recycling your newspaper and riding your bike and planting a tree in your backyard. But it was thanks to one of my design teachers in my second year at Emily Carr. Her name is Deborah Shackleton, and she's an amazing woman, that I was introduced to the concept of design thinking and the importance of thinking in terms of systems and using design as a tool to solve problems. Her famous 3 words were, design saves lives. We used to laugh at the time, but the more I started learning about the dire realities like climate change, the more this concept started to really click. So for the rest of my time in school, I decided to dedicate my time and projects towards researching more about climate and one of my favorite things in life, which was food. So the more I learned about it, my interest grew, but also did my concerns. I got really angry the more I knew and the more I found out. Why weren't people talking more about this? Why wasn't climate change on every single front page of media outlets? And even then, I was only scratching the surface. I graduated, very burnt out and broke, but this sense of urgency never really left me. A few months later, I was accepted into one of the largest, most impactful youth leadership summits in the world. It's called One Young World. I decided to use my creative skills and fundraise over $6,000 so I could go to Dublin and not only hear from world-renowned speakers, but also to meet like-minded young leaders that are doing this kind of work from every corner of the planet. And this is where I heard Mary Robinson speak. She's the former president of Ireland, first female president, and the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And for the first time, I heard the term climate justice. She accurately drew the connection between the impacts of climate change and human rights, and how as we transition away from fossil fuels, we must address the needs of the most vulnerable communities. And something clicked. The reality that the most vulnerable communities in my own country, a country that relies so heavily on agriculture, were going to be disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. That without addressing climate change as a human rights issue, we wouldn't even get nearly as far as we absolutely have to. So Mary Robinson asked us to become ambassadors of consciousness and to push really hard to put climate justice at the forefront of everything we did. So it was right there and then that I vowed to dedicate my life to this fight. Despite this very overwhelming realization, I really kept this passion and this fight quite separate from my career as a designer. There was Nayeli, who still had to pay rent in Vancouver and had to go to work from 9 to 5 in publishing. And then there was Nayeli, the climate justice organizer, who was putting in the work after work. But inevitably, the two started to merge over time. And that's partly because at Greystone, we publish nonfiction books on nature, the environment, current affairs, health, social issues. So it took me a while to process how overwhelmed I felt after One Young World, but I realized that the best possible way to get going was to start where I was. Whether I was pitching new book ideas to our team, I was reaching out to potential authors, I was showing up to actions opposing pipelines, or even getting more involved in grassroots organizing. Climate justice started to come into every single thing I did. But the problem was still way too big. The Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, and it didn't feel like a victory. The goals set by our leaders didn't seem ambitious enough. Shortly after the Paris Agreement was signed, I was selected as one of 360 young people from over 90 countries to take part in the first Mary 360 program. And I had 2 other people who were there too. This was an initiative that was led by an organization called World Merit in collaboration with the United Nations. Their intention was to bring together youth from all different backgrounds, fields, and levels of experience from different countries to create an action plan addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I joined as a facilitator for the Climate Action Team, number 13. And my team was composed of 22 young leaders from 19 different countries. And this experience was very intense. We culminated in presenting our ideas at the UN headquarters in New York City. And I heard some wows, but as impressive as that might sound, based on my experience, a lot of these conferences result in actually very little action. By far, what has the most impact is the work that these young leaders are doing back in their communities and their own personal stories. And this is where I met Anusiva, who's like in the front over there. This is my team. She's a powerful young woman from Zimbabwe who does incredible work on gender equality and climate justice. She was also part of our climate action team, and it was her storytelling that once again grounded all of us in the urgency of why climate justice is so important. She told us that back home, in nearby villages, there are young girls who are being pulled out of school and put into prostitution by their own families, because their families are farmers who have relied on agriculture for centuries, and climate impacts have taken away all their livelihoods. They can no longer rely on stable climates to survive and grow their crops. So out of desperation, they're taking away the lives of their own daughters. Let that sink in for a second. Because we no longer can afford to sugarcoat the urgency of this crisis. This is exactly what climate justice is about. Acknowledging the communities around the world who have done close to nothing to cause this crisis are the ones suffering the most. And the decisions we make here are disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable communities in the global south. And as a movement who has been largely led by white, mostly male educated people, we will not meet our targets if we fail to recognize that the systems of oppression that have led to this crisis are the exact same ones feeding the rise of racism against migrants, white supremacy, misogyny, and discrimination. People at a disadvantage are suffering, while those of us who live privileged lives leading these movements are probably reading about them on the news, on social media, and on textbooks. And this is exactly why we have to have the people experiencing injustice and the impacts of them driving our movements. We need indigenous and racialized peoples to be the ones shaping the language and narratives around climate action. They are the ones who need to be given a platform, and their studies need to be heard. At the same time, it becomes more and more evident that all of us have something to lose to climate change. Rising sea levels are displacing coastal communities by the hour, and the UN reported last year that by 2050 we might have up to 1 billion people displaced because of climate change. We don't even have to look too far. Over the last few years, BC has seen some of the worst wildfire seasons in history, and we don't even need statistics for that because all of us who have lived here long enough know just how much worse it has gotten. We also know that Canada is warming at twice the global rate, so it would be very naive to say that we're not being affected as well. There is so much at stake, and we all have something to lose, even when we're in a much more privileged position. And I hold a lot of privilege just being a climate justice organizer in Vancouver and in Canada. I know that the work I do here as an organizer, advocating very publicly for climate resilience, reconciliation, and fossil fuel expansion, I know that even just standing here today could put me at risk back where I'm from, where land defenders doing the same work are being killed every single week, much to indifference of the media. So I'm going to take some water. So until we start recognizing that these challenges are undeniably interconnected, the climate justice means justice, but especially dignity for our people. We will not accomplish the bold systemic changes we need to overcome this crisis. And I know this seems too big and too overwhelming and too depressing. I feel that I really understand that. But the other side of the coin is that this presents us with a huge amount of opportunities. It was by constantly showing up that I realized the vital importance of creativity and justice movements. There is so much power in being able to communicate a message and tell a story, in being able to reach larger audiences through creative work. I began to put more and more of my skills and creativity into my own organizing. So here are some examples. Or not. Cool. So, sure, I did some stuff. And even at that stage, when I was incorporating all of these skills into my climate justice work, I still saw them as separate. I recognized the power and the need for it, but I still saw my career as a separate realm. Oh, there are some. Okay. So here are just some examples of work that I did using those skills to promote events or rallies or just anything that I could support in. And as people started finding out that I could support in those ways, and I was always happy to bring that in. And so that's when I started recognizing how important it was. But it took me a while. And it wasn't until late last year when I took on the role of art and culture coordinator for PowerShift. This was a youth-led climate justice convergence that we held in Ottawa, and we brought hundreds of young people from every corner of the country, even from frontline communities in the north. And this was for them to learn about intersecting issues related to climate justice and how to take action. And this is where I truly found a home in resisting through art. We were able to collaborate with amazing artists from so many different backgrounds and practices who have been using art as a tool for resistance for decades. In running the art space at PowerShift, I witnessed how people from all walks of life were connecting with each other while they collaborate through art. And all of us had a shared goal of visually communicating our message and making it louder and a lot stronger. We had Indigenous youth from remote frontline communities, students, facilitators, organizers, everyone connecting and creating and building community through art. I heard stories from different front lines from across North America from artists like Christy Belcourt and Isaac Murdoch. They're the ones who created some of the most recognizable work from Standing Rock. Some of you guys might recognize this. This is a Thunderbird woman that kind of was all over the place when Standing Rock was happening. And I heard them speak about the magical link between art, storytelling, and resistance. This is a photo that they took there. They're facing police with all this artwork behind the communities that were fighting this pipeline. Art is so powerful. It is its own language form because everyone can connect with it, no matter your age, your race, your gender, or your sexuality. Creativity in any form, from art, design, photography, writing, is a shared language that brings all of us together. Just imagine, the role of art in resistance movements is absolutely critical, because think about how different all of these images would look without the artwork, without the collective power that we all put into making our message loud and clear. These strong visuals are what allowed us to unify a message across languages and across borders. It is a way of telling a story, of highlighting what we're fighting for, and the more it is done, the more recognizable it becomes. The clearer the message, the more powerful the story, and then the greater the impact. So this is all artwork we created during those few days and then did a really powerful action outside of Parliament Hill in Ottawa. And this is what leads me to where I am now. Our Time. Our Time is a nonpartisan national campaign led by young people and millennials from all across the country, pushing and championing a vision for a Green New Deal for Canada. This is a very ambitious plan to tackle climate change and inequality together. As we have seen recently, young people from across the planet have been organizing one of the largest climate mobilizations in history. We are the ones, ultimately, who will live through the most significant impacts of climate change. In Canada, millennials will actually be the largest voting bloc in the upcoming election. So basically, this is a huge opportunity for us to change the narrative. Last fall, the IPCC report reported that we have 12 years to cut our global emissions in half. We're already 11 years away. So we cannot afford to have governments who declare a climate emergency one day and approve a massive pipeline expansion project the next. So we need to make sure that this is one of our last best chances to get Canada moving towards tackling the climate crisis. So we're working to build a voting alliance of thousands of young people from across the country to make sure that we push politicians to get behind a plan like a Green New Deal. And I had the privilege of designing the brand for Our Time. And once again, bring those creative skills to support the movement. I also collaborated with an amazingly talented illustrator called Michelle Clement. And we created some icons to represent the 4 pillars of what our vision for a Green New Deal is. And so first, we're asking that the Green New Deal meets the scale and urgency of the climate crisis and that it takes into account the best available science. 2, that it creates millions of good jobs through a historic mobilization as we move Canada into 100% renewable energy. 3, that it enshrines dignity, justice, and equity for all, in making sure that climate solutions are the ones lifting up marginalized communities on the front lines, because they're the ones bearing the brunt of fossil fuel extraction and climate impacts. And last but not least, that it works in service of real reconciliation. No more lip service, like we've seen for a long time, to make sure that it respects the title, rights, and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. So it is truly our time. And that's not just a slogan. It's not just a brand name. When we say our, we mean everyone. So not just young people, but also the young at heart. Because that's what it will take to match the scale of the challenge. This was actually a couple of weeks ago outside the CBC. We had a mass action across Canada calling them to host a climate leaders debate on climate change. So we tend to have a certain perception of the skills required to be involved. You know, that holds a lot of us back. It held me back for a long time. We tend to believe that these issues are beyond us and assume that someone else will take care of it, that politicians will finally get their act together, that corporations will come to terms with their role, that environmentalists will make sure to get it out there and get the attention they deserve. But I really hope that if anything has resonated with you today from the stories I've shared, is that one, creativity, art, and storytelling play a huge role in justice movements. That everything we fight for is connected. It doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, where you live, or how much you earn. It doesn't matter whether you are more passionate about migrant rights, plastics in the ocean, gender equality, animal rights, zero waste, that you want healthier communities or a stronger economy. The systems behind all the challenges we face as human society are deeply interconnected. And you can't address one without impacting the whole, and you can't solve one without looking at the bigger picture. And especially as creative people, it is our responsibility to apply our skills and our talents to this larger narrative and realize that we don't need a specific degree, we don't need to be a David Suzuki, and we don't need to be a sustainability expert if that's even a thing. We don't need an army of experts. We need to keep doing what we do best, because being creative across our different mediums is what's going to make a difference. Whether we are visual artists, musicians, performers, whether we are good with words, a brush, or even a typeface. We need to keep being creative in our own unique ways and make sure we apply our skills to the bigger picture of justice. Because that's what justice is. It's about building strong, diverse, and dignified communities that thrive because we see the value in our different skills. So think about these things moving forward. How does our work, our creativity, fit into this larger picture of a just world? How can we use this opportunity to communicate our message to a much larger audience? How can we actively participate in sharing the stories that lift up the most marginalized communities around us? Because while our individual actions are important, this is about us as a collective. We are at a very critical moment in time, and we have a responsibility to use those skills to influence and shape ideas into action. But most importantly, try to actively support justice movements, especially youth-led ones, that challenge and fight against the powerful influences who are destroying vulnerable communities and our climate. Challenge the systems of oppression in place that uphold our power. Vote. Do it for all of us who can't. I can't vote. I've been in Canada for 11 years and I still can't vote. So on that note, I really wanted to leave you today with some opportunities to actually take on that responsibility and actively contribute to something like the climate justice movement, so that maybe we all join efforts and applying our work, our skill, and our time. So these are some things coming up. The first one, as I mentioned, in our time, we need everyone on board. And so if you go on our website, you can sign up, whether you're under 35 and want to organize with us. If you're over 35 and young at heart, we also need you. And so a really easy way to do it is just to go in and sign up to be on the loop of what we're doing. But as I mentioned right now, our main thing is pushing the CBC to hold a federal leaders debate on climate and a Green New Deal. So if you go on that link, and you can do it right after this, even though your phones are on silent, it'll take you a minute. And it's building up a lot of momentum, so I really encourage you guys to do this. Then, on a more fun note, and related to art and creativity, we're hosting an art build with 350 Vancouver, which is the group I mostly organize with. This is coming up on August 21st. It's going to be at an artist studio. I don't have the exact address, but if you follow 350 Vancouver on social media or reach out to me, I'll have those details. It'll be so much fun, screen printing, banners, anything goes. Then, right after that, there's a Climate Creatives workshop and party hosted by the UBC Climate Hub. And that sounds like a lot of fun. It's going to be at Patagonia on August 22nd. And that one is like a more relaxed environment, talking about these issues with speakers where there's also music and food and drinks. So it sounds like a lot of fun, and I might be speaking at it potentially as well. There's also a street murals action training hosted by Greenpeace, and this is an incredible one because it's almost a day-long one where you learn how to make massive street murals that take a lot of people to make. I'm pretty sure there's only a few spots left, so if you go on Eventbrite and search Street Murals Action Training Vancouver, you should be able to find it. And I encourage you to do that today if you're actually interested. And then the last one, which I think is one of the most important ones, is the global climate strike. As we've seen, Greta Thunberg has led this amazing movement of young people striking for climate and taking this very seriously. And they've asked for a global day of action so that everyone from all different ages and backgrounds can actually join. And the one in Vancouver will be on September 27th, and that's being led by the Sustainability Teams, which is a group of high school students championing the climate strikes here. So I really encourage all of you to kind of take that step and ask yourself some questions when you go and keep doing this creative work, and hopefully I'll see you out there really, really soon. Thank you.
Hi, that was amazing. So inspired, so empowering. You're incredible. We did have a conversation, though, about the fact that we're in this room and there's all these amazing people that want to do more. But how do we start that conversation with people who maybe don't see it the same way that we do? How do we get people into the room and have these open conversations and learn and grow together with people that might be a little bit different than us, people that we see as maybe being the antithesis of the activists, of the climate warriors, of the justice seekers?
I think that's part of what I wanted to touch on, saying those things, that a lot of times we feel like we don't have the right set of skills or we don't have the right background, and that turns us away. And that held me back for a long time, and I didn't feel like I could be a part of the movement because I don't look like the people who lead the movement or have those skills or an environmental background. But I think it just starts with having those conversations in your own personal network, and it goes beyond creative stuff. I strongly believe that everyone is creative, and so whether you're a scientist or an engineer, I think those people are incredibly creative and apply that to their work. So I think it's just about, again, reminding everyone that we all have something to lose, and there's nothing that should stop us from at least doing the very least we can with the skills we have. So I would say just start having those conversations within your own networks, and then just be more politically engaged, because that's what's slowly starting to bring people in to these conversations, seeing just how many people around the world are starting to catch up to this. It's very powerful. So I would say that even just Creative Mornings, hosting more themes like these, where we can reach out to other people and just invite as many outsiders as we possibly can. But I would say it just starts with your own networks. That's what I try to do. This week I was quoted in a Vice article because I tweeted out asking how I could radicalize my mom and moving her activism from "I tell everyone to not use plastic straws" to "let's dismantle the systems of oppression that uphold the fossil fuel industry." But it resonated with a lot of people. So I think there's a lot of amazing resources out there on how to bridge those gaps. I guess if you start by doing that research, I think it's very easy to start pulling other people.
Thank you. I have some questions for you. And if you have questions, please raise your hand before, and then we'll come back to you. Perfect. So the thing that I find overwhelming about this movement is it feels like it's huge. It feels like the people at the top who are running the big corporations, who are sort of aren't making the changes, and that's where the big change needs to happen. And so at the bottom with us, it doesn't feel like there's much that we can do, and any small impact feels so small. So how would you engage with that line of thinking?
I think it's the realization that it's all supported by systems. And so when we talk about even things like the Green New Deal, it's about rethinking those things. But it's not going to happen if we, who are the ones making our decisions through consuming, through buying, through voting, through all of those things, if we don't push for that, they're not going to change it. And even it comes out to showing up on the streets. I mean, no one was talking about the impacts of climate on youth until one girl stood outside of Parliament. And now literally millions of people around the planet are showing up. The media is starting to catch up. This is not, it feels like it's very little, but in reality, that's what's going to do it. To have people actually show up en masse. Because again, while our individual actions are so important, it's not going to be as fast as it has to be unless we keep pushing those people in power, and we keep pushing those things forward. But I say don't get discouraged, because it's really easy to lose hope. And I think that with climate, it's something that gives us a lot of anxiety. And I totally feel that. But I think that there's a lot of hope that comes out of being part of a movement where you're part of a collective. It's not just an individual thing. The more you do this work or the more you show up, simply just showing up, there's just an amazing sense of community that like keeps kind of that hope going. And so I encourage people to not feel discouraged by it and keep going at your individual actions, but know that this is a lot bigger than that.
Thank you. And then I saw a question over here.
Thanks. My thoughts were exactly what you were talking about, is the corporations. And I think I've been doing this for a long time too, and a lot of people who do this, they're saying, oh, they're, non-animal eaters and they're, young and whatever, but we're not really changing the mind of the corporate people. Have we ever thought of actually going into corporations and being on a panel somewhere of talks that they do, talking to the people who work there, those kind of things? I don't see that we're doing anything to change the mind by informing, not just speaking out with signs about what it is, how we can sustainably, what can we do to change? Do you I'm not probably understanding it, but I'm just wondering where we can get a group of people in your organization going into corporations and speaking to people about how we can change, why it's really important to change. Because I think a lot of those corporations are tired of it and just turn a blind ear.
Well, I find that things like corporations or industry respond to what the changes in society are. So, for example, right now, workers have a lot of power to make those changes. And unfortunately, they're being targeted by like narratives of fear. And you're going to lose your job and you're going to lose your livelihood. But ultimately, both sides want the exact same thing. We want to make sure that everyone transitions fairly, that everyone has a just job, that everyone has like that dignity and livelihood. They're just using a very different narrative, right? And Canada is a perfect example. Like oil and gas workers are being told like, oh, climate activists are a threat to you. But we want the same thing. We are just not using that narrative that's resonating a lot. So I think that that's one of those things. Like when you're in that position, is changing that narrative from fear. I mean, ultimately, all these big companies know that if we move towards renewables, like they're still going to make money. They just need to make that transition. They're starting to catch up. It's just not fast enough. So even things as like government action and just like everyday people is very important to kind of make that point. And again, I think like my partner who works in zero waste say a lot, like we make a decision every time we choose to buy something, every time we choose to consume something. So that's something that we can't make, like we can't make that a small thing. It's still a really big deal. So hopefully that's something that will resonate. But yes, I mean, going in there, encouraging workers who work in those industries to question those things so that they get paid attention, otherwise no. And my biggest thing is just, again, lifting marginalized communities in this movement, because that's the main thing that we're missing, I think. And so as we see those faces and those voices represented, I think a lot more impact will come.
Thank you. Were there any questions from over here?
There's one over there.
There's one over here. Yes.
Thanks so much. Amazing and inspiring talk. I just wanted to pick up on your last point about raising up marginalized voices. I wonder if you have advice for a white person in terms of how can I both champion this movement and also make space and step back for marginalized communities to be leading or at the forefront or have their voices centered.
No, that's a really good question. I think, first of all, like, don't be held back by fear of making a mistake or not being a good ally. Like, I think this is a learning process, and even these communities are always so willing to just like walk through with that, because we see the impact and the necessity, I guess, to have us collaborate with each other. So first of all, like, don't be held back by feeling white guilt and saying like, I don't have a place, or I don't want to mess up. It's okay to make mistakes. And I think I heard in another of the talks, like, it's only a mistake if you don't learn from it. So I think it's just being actively listening to those things and just genuinely approach movements and then ask, like, what do you need me to do? Rather than, take the lead. Just support whoever else needs to be leading. But in Canada, probably one of the best ones is just supporting Indigenous communities, Indigenous leadership programs, youth especially. I think that's something that we can all do. And to be honest, honest, even like the older folks in the audience, money. I mean, like, we are fighting these massive corporations and we don't have money. So even it's as simple as donating and supporting those communities who are actually on the front lines doing the heavy lifting. So that would be my advice. But still, just show up and don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Hello, thank you so much. On the topic of money, I was wondering if you personally find, if you feel pressure or even personal desire, like an issue in balancing your desire to give back to climate justice with one of your skills as a designer and the reality of needing to make money off of your work to live and survive in Vancouver. Is that part of the reason why you kind of keep your design work separate at your job? I'm just interested. I feel like a lot of people feel the duty to use the skills that they have to help out, but would feel guilt to accept money for it or that kind of thing. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I find that doing all of this work, and that's why I mean like bringing your skills to movement, because I see it more as a responsibility. But of course, it's like we have to be mindful of that. And I have to say, though, a lot of the work I've done is actually being paid. So it's not that, because people understand just how important it is and how necessary, and the more we do this kind of stuff, the more like people realizing just the value of having a nicer poster that will appeal to more people. So I've actually, not just done the work for free, but even if you are already doing some volunteering, apply your skills to that volunteering. I think it's as simple as starting there. And then, I mean, my work merges a lot. Maybe one day I'll transition into just climate justice work. I don't know. But I think that, again, even if I'm doing that, I'll be bringing design skills. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm not asking everyone to just work for free. But if you have the capacity and ability to go and contribute your own into a movement that doesn't have the resources, it's still extremely valuable. And again, this is a lot bigger than that. So if you have the capacity, like it's also very gratifying and amazing way of building communities. So, so if you come to one of our art builds, you'll see how fun it is.
I have one question. We're unfortunately right out of time, but I have one question that I'd like to conclude with. And that is, I think an important part of planning for the future is creating vision for what it is that we're fighting for and what it is that we're trying to create, what it is the climate action that you're involved in is trying to create. What is the vision?
I think we need such ambitious plans. We have to go into this without fear of, making radical changes. And I think that that's something like the Green New Deal being championed. I mean, this started in the U.S., pushed by youth of color, which is, a very different face to what we're used to seeing. And so things like that are resonating all over the world. I mean, in Spain, they are starting a Green New Deal. In Canada, we're talking about it in the election. And I think in the UK, so like people are starting to catch up on that. So just even that, and realizing that climate impacts don't know those colonial borders, it'll still affect all of us the same way. So my vision is that in the next few years, hopefully very soon, we have all these people, governments, and society, and countries basically get behind plans like the Green New Deal, because again, if we put that pressure into revolutionizing how the world works, it's going to happen. And it can happen really quickly. I don't think it's a radical vision. To me, it's very rational. We just have to make sure that everyone gets on board. And I think it's happening with things like the Green New Deal. But again, if we don't show up to vote, and if we don't show up and put that pressure, it's going to be so much slower than it needs to be. And so I think my vision is that we're going to get behind those things and see those faces and different voices represented at the top instead of what we're used to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I get a big round of applause for Nayeli?